Well, hello there. You are watching the Two-Spirit Reconciliation panel. This is the very first in a dialogue series that will be hosted by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. My name is Kandi Palmiter. I will be your guide through this hour. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Bear with us because this is the very first in the series. We are dealing with the technology. As you know, this is the new normal of isolation. So each of us are isolated in our homes, and we are hoping this is going to stream smoothly to you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kandi Palmiter. I'm an orator, a humorist, and a writer. You might know my face from the Kandi Show on APTN or know my voice from my radio show on CBC or Q on CBC, which I hosted for quite a few months. I have two wonderful conversationalists to speak today that you'll be hearing from, both in their own cities. We've got Harlan Pruden coming to us from Vancouver, and Albert Mcleod is joining us from Winnipeg. This is a really poignant time to be having this. As you know, during this time of lockdown, we've had such an upheaval in talk about race relations, anti-racist education. In the last few weeks, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights has had allegations of both racism and homophobia. So although those of us in the activist world have been screaming for people to look at their organizations for generations, it seems that right now is a time when people really are taking that time to look, try to identify the systemic barriers and areas of discrimination that exist within their own organizations. So it's a perfect time to have this discussion. I will say, acknowledging the fact that we have some voices missing here. It would be wonderful if this was a perfect world and we were all live together and that we had some more Two-Spirit sisters and some more trans voices in this conversation. But again, this is the first in a series of conversations, and we hope that it gets the ball rolling in terms of dialogue. So I will let our esteemed speakers introduce themselves, and after that, I will let you know how this next hour and a half will run. So maybe Albert, if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Melbourne Mcleod. I live in Winnipeg. I've been a co-director of the Two-Spirited People of Manitoba since 2006. As well, I've been involved with the Nichiwaka Native Gay Society here in Winnipeg since 1986. I originally come from the Paw, Manitoba, which is a northern community about 500 miles north of Winnipeg. And my ancestry is from the Scituate Cree Nation and the Métis community of Norrie House in Cross Lake. I'm 64 years old. I have a 20-year-old godson and a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old granddaughters.
Welcome, Albert. Harlan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Harlan Pruden, Ewaka no mani, niha neha niha ayakwe. Greetings, my relatives. My government name is Harlan Pruden. And my Indian name, it's actually in Sioux. I was doing some work on the Rosebud Reservation, and they honored me with the name Waka no mani. Waka being spirit, good spirit, bad spirit, neutral spirit. You know, I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can like suck up a lot of space and do absolutely nothing. And so that part of my name is a responsibility of how do I want to show up. And so I try to show up, my intent is to show up with good thoughts, good words, and good actions. I sometimes fail, but every time it's not a failure if I learn from that failure. And so a mistake or a misstep is a learning opportunity. Nom is two and mani is a sacred journey. And so I was going to get that translated into Cree. I am First Nations Cree. My mother is from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father's from the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. Two different reservations, but a part of the same Treaty 6 territory. Or I say in my own humble opinion, that I'm from the best nation in the whole wide world. I am modeling what we should all be saying, right?
Yes.
And I have been working with and for the Two-Spirit community since about 2004. In New York City, I founded the Northeast Two-Spirit Society. I did a lot of work and a lot of advocacy. I founded the twospiritjournal.com, which is a multi-platform interactive Two-Spirit news site. I also serve here. I now live in Vancouver for the last 5 years. And I serve on the Vancouver Public Library. I'm a trustee and did a lot of consulting. I think a highlight is, and which I would love, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, is I was called upon and appointed twice by President Obama to the US's Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS. And where I provided, that body did was provide advice, information, and recommendations to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as well as the White House around HIV, both prevention, care, and treatment. And on that body, I was the only federally recognized Native, as well as the only Two-Spirit person. And so carrying that water for my community at that highest level. I'd also just want to take pause and just thank the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation for creating this space of looking at Two-Spirit reconciliation. It is such an honor, and I am humbled by their action and their dedication to lean into this conversation. And then finally is I also have to thank my Coast Salish relatives for allowing me and tolerating my presence on their territory. And so I must do a land acknowledgement because this is not my territory and not my land. So it is with the greatest humility and honor that I say, thank you, hi, and that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to both of you. Now, to you watching us on Facebook, here's how it's going to roll. We are going to be with you for about an hour and a half. I am going to start by asking both Albert and Harlan some questions. We're going to have a bit of a conversation, and then I'm going to open it up to you so that you can ask questions. This is, if I lean back, you can see that my shirt says "Love is Love." This is a place of love and acceptance and inclusion. We want it to be a learning space. So we welcome questions. Do not worry if you don't know the exact terminology to use for the questions. Please just get your questions out. This is why we're here. We want you to learn. We will, however, not tolerate hate. As our friend Taylor Swift says, haters gonna hate, but we're gonna brush that off. So any really hateful, inappropriate comments, we are going to delete them, and we invite you to be with us and to be here in a space of learning. And if you're someone who is lacking some understanding, this is the perfect place for you. It's a safe place for you to ask questions. I will not be revealing the names of people who ask questions, so please don't worry about not having the appropriate language, but come with an intention of love and kindness and acceptance, particularly for the fact that Albert and Harlan have taken the time to be with you today to help to answer some of those questions. So Albert and Harlan, if you are ready, we are going to get going.
Ready.
We want to start with a bit of a discussion around the notion of the word Two-Spirit. Some of it, I identify as queer, some of us identify as Two-Spirit. It's a question we get often. What does Two-Spirit mean? What did it mean in the past? What does it mean now? People argue that the term is understood, but I'm not so sure that people actually understand it. So Albert, I'd like you to walk us through your understanding of what happened to the notion of gender roles, identities, and gender expression, both historically and now that colonization has taken hold.
Well, I think if you look back in history of the Americas, and I include South America in our discussion today because, you know, we know there are the dates of colonization, first contact with European people who are looking to, you know, find spices and other, you know, extraction resources. So we know there's timelines involved, and we know that prior to that, indigenous communities were very sophisticated and complex. And with regard to gender identity, you know, their understanding of human behavior and condition, and we know that goes back, you know, thousands of years, like 20,000 years of social development. So it was very sophisticated. And when the colonizers first arrived here, they were men, sort of patriarchal men that involved the church, military, and royalty. They really didn't appreciate the complexity of indigenous structure of family. that was inclusive of LGBT people or trans people in their societies, and that a lot of slavery happened at the early contact. So it was very much about imposing a Euro-Christian idea or ideal about a binary gender, which is male and female, onto these, very complex societies. And it, it's been, in some cases, 300 years, 400 years, depending on how long the exposure has been. And coming out of that period in the late 40s and 50s, we have the mainstream gay liberation movement in North America, Canada, and the US especially. Whereas people who had lived, for decades hiding their identity really in, agricultural societies, which were very binary constructed, and that there was a lot of shame about being homosexual or lesbian or bisexual or trans. So for many generations in Canada, people really hid that because there was a threat of expulsion, of violence, and even death, a death sentence in some cases early on if you were outed as being gay or homosexual. And coming out of that, though, for Indigenous people, most of us would find community and family in the gay bars in Canada, which were kind of safer spaces for us, where we could be ourselves, meet other people, and really have a sense of liberation and freedom. But because of racism, systemic racism in Canada, we kind of lived on the edges of the gay community. And it wasn't until HIV pandemic affected North America that we began to organize, because of a very serious situation. A lot of our peers and friends were diagnosed with AIDS very early on. So we began to organize, and by 1990, we were organizing under the LGBT acronym at the time. And then in 1990, which we know is the year of Oka, the Oka resistance, also the Meech Lake resistance as well. So I'm not surprised that, the term Two-Spirit was introduced at that time in 1990, because really, the intersection of Indigenous rights, where if you're Inuit, Métis, or First Nations, it does intersect with Indigenous LGBT people. So that year was our year of liberation as well. And so the term came through a ceremony from Dr. Myra Laramie, who was one of the participants. And I think it's important to realize that our decolonization and our reconciliation process is through our culture and our traditions and our language. And that for me, a lot of people assume that the term Two-Spirit is relating just to male and female gender identity or sex, but I think it's more profound than that, in that the First Nations in Manitoba have all, established a traditional name for their communities. So renaming or self-naming, I think, is an important aspect of liberation. And that term, when it was introduced through ceremony at our gathering here in Manitoba in 1990, resonated with the other participants. And so it had meaning to them. And when I think about that, as queer LGBT people in North America, for hundreds of years, we've been sort of ostracized, shamed, and with the church. And this is the intersection with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Indian residential schools, and I know day schools as well, that in those days we were not seen as spiritual people. We were seen as corrupt. We were seen as a work of the devil for many decades. And so it's ironic that in 1990 we reaffirm our spirituality, and not just with one spirit, with two spirits. So I think, internationally, Indigenous people of Canada have reaffirmed the idea of spirituality in the broader LGBT community, and that our acronym, the 2S, has been attached to the front of that, is really acknowledging that as LGBT people, we are human, and we are spiritual, and we have rights, and we're just fabulous people.
I always love the fact that it has the word spirit in it, because for so many queer people, if they are raised in faith, in religion, they often lose religion in terms of being, if they want to be who they are, they cannot exist in both of those worlds. So I love that that term includes the word spirit in it. Harlan, I want to come to you now to talk about the fact that 30 years ago, as Albert mentioned, the term was adopted to describe two-spirited people. Can you talk about why that is important when we talk about the framework of reconciliation?
Sure. Thank you so much. And Albert, thank you so much for sharing your teachings, as well as that history. Because I think that if we don't know our history, we don't know where we're going, right? And so it's just an honor to be here with you, Albert, who can speak of that gathering. And I think that that was a pivotal point within our own history of who we are as two-spirit people. So I would just like to answer the question, and because I think my other name for today will be either She Talks Long or Motormouth Mabel, right?
I like Motormouth Mabel.
So for two-spirit is, the first thing that I would like to explain is the way that I conceive of the term, as well as the way in which I inform the work, is two-spirit is a placeholder. It's in English. It's a relatively new term from the 1990, that Albert just shared. And that it is, I don't know what a good word, it's transnational, or if folks don't know what that, it's pan-Indian, right? And it speaks to multiple nations. And we know that there is not 100% consensus around the term two-spirit. So two-spirit is just a placeholder. And it's a placeholder for us to organize and to organize those individuals who are either that are diverse within their sexualities or laid beyond, and diverse within their gender roles, and gender expressions, right? And what I'm trying to do is not use the LGBT framework. I'm just using descriptive language. And so it's those individuals who that are diverse, who embody a diverse sexualities, gender roles, and gender expressions, and who are indigenous to Turtle Island. And I love how Albert expanded that of like saying our relatives in Central America as well as in South America. And that two-spirit is a community organizing tool and not an identity. Implicit within identity means it's an endpoint. Kind of like when I came out as gay, then I joined the gay community, and then I tried to figure out what gay was, right, or is. And so gay was the identity and the endpoint, right? Where for two-spirit, it is a way for us to identify, to organize and to identify those individuals who are diverse sexualities, gender roles and expressions, who are indigenous to Turtle Island. But then the work is to, becomes nation specific. And so like, if I were male assigned, no, I am male assigned, but if I were Anishinaabe, my word within my language would be Agukwe, where I'm Cree, so my word is Ayakwe. Ayakwe is the identity. That's the endpoint. And so it gets really messy when we like look at and we try to operationalize two-spirit as an identity, as an endpoint. And it's not an endpoint, it's just a placeholder. And so, and it's going, so, and thereby two-spirit is going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or a member of. And so there's not one way of being two-spirit, because it's going to be nation specific. And so it adds into the complexity of it. But then speaking, and I really wish that I was around and more active in 1990 so that I could go and witness this historic moment, this epoch where the community came together and said, we reject this French word berdache, we reject LGBT, and what we do is we're going to organize under this auspices of two-spirit. And a part of that is that they were rejecting outsiders naming us.
Yes.
Like the word berdache. And so it was, as I look at it, and again, I'm peering back in history, is that it was the ultimate expression, an expression of sovereignty, sovereignty of body and sovereignty of land. With that proclamation and saying we choose Two-Spirit as the way that we're going to organize and move forward, is they were saying you outsiders, you French missionaries, you members of the academy who are studying us, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to us. And it was a political statement as well. Now, what that means for reconciliation is, you know, I would like to start off with a quote from Rye Morgan, who is the director of the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation, is that you cannot delegate reconciliation. You have to own it. Whoever you are as an individual or a leader of a group or an organization, there's a call to action that relates to you. Now, there are two interlocking concepts of truth, which I call legacy work, that's that history work, right, and reconciliation. And so what I would like to do is to, again, bifurcate. Truth is the legacy work, and where we know our history, the impact of colonization here in Canada and the rest of the world. And so we're already starting to learn and unpack that history of the residential boarding schools, the day schools, the 60s scoop and all that other stuff. But reconciliation is also two contiguous conversations that must fold out at the same time. For Native people like us right now, and those who are joining us virtually, for Native people, it is for us to either continue or to begin our healing work. The reconciliation is understanding the pain, but then for us to actually heal from that pain. For non-Native people, their charge is to learn our collective history and then to reconcile that history with today so that they do not repeat that history, so they do not become today's colonizers. And, or where they passively gain, play the system for their benefit, or where they passively, or they actively game the system, being racist, right? And then there's the other component of reconciling the future. And reconciliation is where we either, as Native people, we heal, and we begin getting in better relations with one another. We start unpacking and start decolonizing our minds, our souls, and who we are. And for non-Native people, it is for them to get in better relations and then for them to share their power, like move aside. Stop talking about us as vulnerable populations. Stop talking about us as that they're here to save us. Sorry, Noodles, as someone who has survived 529 years of colonization and come from a long line of folks like Albert, like yourself, we know how to survive you. And so the other thing is, and I've reflected a lot about this I work at the BC Center for Disease Control, and we've been leading efforts in how does our organization embrace and understand and operationalize a lens of reconciliation. And I was like, why didn't Justice Sinclair offer a definition of reconciliation? And I believe is what the commission did, as well as also the National Center, is if they would have offered a definition for reconciliation, it would have been dead on arrival. And what I mean by that is reconciliation is a process. It's going to look something different for Vancouver Public Library. It's going to look something for you, different for you, Palm, and for you, Albert. It's going to look something different if you're a school or if you're a health agency. And so there, again, just like Two-Spirit, it's a process, and it cannot be an endpoint. And so what I do is I offer the closest thing. It's a framework for reconciliation. First of all, I add in a C, so it's reconciliation.
Nice.
And reconciliation is simply the intentional, reflective, and communal self-examination of our ongoing action or journey as we chart a new way forward together. Now, let me unpack all of that. It's simple. It just means getting in better relations, where we love one another one day. And if love is too much, respect and honor one another, where you don't think you're better than me and that you are here to save me. So it's simple, getting in better relations. It's intentional. It's going to take a lot of thought to us to unpack things. And so it's going to be hard work in that self-reflexology, but also for people to lean in. It is reflective. We are going to make mistakes, either in our own healing journey where I act out because I don't know any better, or when non-native people, when they become sites of colonization in a contemporary setting. So it's reflective. But when you make a mistake, it's a learning opportunity. And then it is this communal self-examination where, and this is a native concept, and I'll own it as a Cree concept, of what is good for me is good for you, and what is good for all of you is good for me. And we must think of ourselves as communal and self at the same time, and rather than 19th century liberalism of I as the individual am a member of society. Of our ongoing action or journey, and again, it's agency. Meaning we can think all the great thoughts of being in good relations, but if there is no action, then it just becomes an intent. We can think great things, but it has to be action and breathed into how we walk. As we journey, as we chart a new way forward together, and that means that if we all are in good relations and we get to where we are, and we still love and honor and respect one another, wherever we are is the right place. And so I actually don't know where this experiment is going of reconciliation, but I do know that if we make it all there together and we've not left people behind, and we get there and we still honor, respect, love, and lift up one another, where we end up will be the right place. And so a part of that is making sure that our two-spirit relatives, like those words, Ayakwe, Agukwe, Winkde, Ichamana, is that we've always been here. As long as I have wind in my lungs, I'll always be here. But we must decolonize, and we must make sure that we all, as Native folks in our healing journey, are supporting one another, and that we're in good relations with one another, both internally and externally, as we move forward together. So in closing, Two-Spirit is the intersectionality of those who embody diverse sexualities, gender roles, expressions, and who are Indigenous to Turtle Island is a community organizing tool and not an identity. It is going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or a member of. Two-Spirit refers to a history or a tradition that predates Western notions and concepts such as LGBTQI+, and is about reclaiming and restoring our honor, respect, and dignity within an individual's nation. This work is deep decolonizing work and centers one's ingenuity and calls Two-Spirit people home, and thereby is about mending of the sacred hoop. That's my answer.
Thank you so much for that, Harlan. I love the concept of it being a placeholder and not an actual identity. And you reminded me of when you spoke about people not trying to save us. I think in this time of such heightened awareness, it's so important for people to understand that, the notion that we don't need to be saved. The wonderful writer Thomas King was here in Toronto 2 years ago. I had the deep honor of interviewing him. It was an audience of about 500 people, and afterwards we opened it for questions, and this woman stood up and said, well, how can I as a white woman help you? And without a moment's hesitation, Thomas King said, stay out of our way. it kind of took her back, but it caused that whole audience of 500 people to think about, oh yeah, they know what they need to do. They just need us to get out of the way and stopping them from doing it. So thank you for including that in that wonderful answer. You know, the reconciliation calls for action, it's been 5 years since they have been out. I often wonder how many Canadians even know one of those calls to action, how many Canadians are moving on those. Although there was no actual call to action specifically on our community, I do want to talk a bit about the calls to action. Albert, as a Two-Spirit person, why are the calls to action important to you? And where do you see yourself in those calls to action?
Well, I think, with the Truth and Reconciliation process, as well as the 94 calls to action, is that, it is a starting point for a conversation. And yes, it is not gender specific. And thinking back on it, I was sort of miffed that it didn't mention how residential and day schools were used as tools to segregate Indigenous children based on the colonial idea of gender, where that wasn't a natural construct in their own communities. And so again, it was over 100-year period where this practice became so deeply rooted in the psyches of Indigenous elders and families that it was hard to separate it out as being non-Indigenous. So that even today, with the TRC report, it's not done that in identifying the tools as that, the schools as that mechanism that still influences the structures in our communities today. And I believe, for over 100 years in every First Nations, Inuit, and Métis community, there's a church. And until recently, the last 40 years, there was a priest or a convent of nuns. And we can't forget that, right? That I think 80% of Indigenous people in Canada follow various Christian faiths, prominently a Roman Catholic and Anglican. And we haven't, really processed that. So for me, the calls for action, especially, I think it's number 58, where it talks about an apology from the Pope. And to me, we haven't had these conversations about the various, the 6 churches who are involved with this sort of inculcation to, homophobia and transphobic attitudes against Indigenous Two-Spirit people for generations, that they haven't been held to account for what they did or what they were doing and the logic behind it. They need to, there's very, very few forums with the churches in Canada around Indigenous LGBT people and the impact of Indian residential and day schools, and just, society in general. And that, a lot of times, it's resulted in suicide, poverty, homelessness. And, we need to have that dialogue with the churches. And, and I do, support the Pope coming to Canada and apologizing to First Nations and Inuit and Métis people for what happened in the years of colonization.
The church hasn't really come there in terms of homophobia, even outside of the Indigenous community. As a person who was raised Catholic, that was a really difficult time for me when I, as I grew in age and started to have a bigger understanding of that religion, the fact that they saw me as a sinner and causing me to then leave the very religion that I was raised in with my family and all my extended relatives. So it's interesting that you talk about the church, because homophobia is still in many segments of Christianity alive and well.
Well, I don't think it was accidental. You have to realize that it was a strategy of colonization, and really it was to break the spirits of the children so that they wouldn't fight for their land. It was a very cynical strategy where the church was involved with that, with the state and with the military or the police, that it was a land grab. And it was a very cynical, attack on children's minds. And to me, the work we do with Two-Spirit Youth, a lot of it is about mental health and the teasing, the shaming, the ridiculing, the violence because they come out as gay or trans. And, a lot of times, even within our own systems, are, trained, well-qualified staff people, Indigenous organizations, they still harbor that sort of, entrenched homophobia in their minds. And, they talk the good talk, but really the process is to try to assimilate us into a heteronormative, way of living that really equates to their belief system, where it really should be separate from that, and their work should be secular.
Mm. Thank you for that, Albert. Harlan, I'm going to put the same question to you. Where do you see yourself in the calls to action, and why are they important to you as an individual?
Sure. So I take a different reading of the 94 calls to action. And so it's like building upon my last comment, that's what I was presenting, and I was like speaking emphatically. It's an argument, right? And it's a position. Let me be more transparent. It's a position, right? And so it's a deep decolonizing work. And so, and there is also a fluidity. And so I must honor in which that I am gay. When I show up on a club at Friday night, or go to, for Pride, I'm a gay man, right? But I stand before you as a Two-Spirit community organizer. But when I'm working with my Native community, I'm a Yahweh, Two-Spirit in my own language, right?
Right.
And so it doesn't make me different. It's just, how do we show up? But a part of that is there's a fluidity of how do I show up? I'm the same person. But like when I'm out on a club at Friday night, I don't want to talk about Two-Spirit stuff. So I just say I'm a gay man, right? Or I don't have to say who I am. I just show up, right?
Yeah.
But when push comes to shove and someone says, what are you, or who are you? My first response is Niha Nehiao. I am Cree.
Right.
And so it is a centering, and within that statement, because a Yahweh is a part of our Cree language and our tradition and our history and our experience, I am there as a Two-Spirit person. And so when I read the 94 calls to action, because I'm already there, is I see myself infused in all of the 94 calls to action as a Two-Spirit person. So if we look at the 14th recommendation, we call upon the federal government to enact an Aboriginal Language Act that incorporates the following principles. And there are 5 principles. A part of that language retention and promotion is to include words like a Yahweh, like a Gukwe, and all of the many ways in which that we talked about Two-Spirit. And so we can go through each of the recommendations, and although Two-Spirit isn't mentioned, my ingenuity is mentioned, and within my ingenuity, Nehiao, is I'm there. And so I see myself in all 94 calls to action, and I don't need a separate call out and a separate bullet point that speaks to either Two-Spirit, which would be a little awkward in that, again, it's a community organizing tool or strategy. And so it is a part of that, as I really deeply appreciate and honor the work of the calls to action, as well as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, or UNDRIP, as well as the principles of reconciliation, that I am there already. And I think that, anytime I meet someone, Two-Spirit or not, and even with their, I see it play out with the Two-Spirit community. When we say, hey, where are you from? No one says, I'm Two-Spirit, or I'm this. Yeah. They say, I am Anishinaabe, I am Navajo, I am Sioux, I am Cree. And that is that's who they are. But in that, there is a declaration in which that we already are there. And so I don't think we need a 95th or another call to action that calls us out, because we're there already. Mm. And it's also a call and a clarion call to our straight, cis, heterosexual Native relatives to see us. And don't.
Harlan,
yep.
For the viewer, explain what cis means.
Cis means that when that when your conception of your gender, your internal, like who you are, like I identify as a man, although I'm male assigned, and that the alignment from what my internal, I am a man, aligns to my body, my assignment, right?
Right.
So I could conceive and look at myself and envision that I am a woman, or I am Two-Spirit, or And there may be a misalignment to my actual physical body. So I could say I'm a woman through and through, yet I still am male assigned. And so when there is a disconnect between the assignment, physical, and our internal conversation, we say that that is trans. But if there is an alignment, I am a man and I am male assigned, where there's alignment, we say that that's cisgender. Why we need that concept is often when we were talking about trans and trans issues, is that trans folks were the only people that had gender.
Right.
And so when we say cisgendered, it is, saying you, just because you identify as a man and you're male assigned, you also have a gender. And there's an alignment between your internal conversation and your physical. And so it's a way to call that into place, where we just don't dump everything onto our trans brothers and sisters and say, you're the only ones that have genders, and that we have to talk about you, and we have to so it's a way for us to call ourselves into the conversation and to own who we are.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. And so pivoting back is that they are incredibly important to me around that whole, and I think that there is much work for us as Indigenous people to going back to reclaiming who we are, but also not being selective in our reclaiming of that history. That Two-Spirit has always been here. Our Two-Spirit relatives have always been here. Our Two-Spirit relatives will always be here. And so what we must do is to call them back in. Because there's a teaching that was given to me freely by an elder, is that we as Native people didn't throw our people away.
Yes.
So when we disparagingly pick up the tools of the colonizer, and I become a fag, or I become all those disparaging words,
yeah.
is that we're discarding and throwing our relatives away. We never did that. We always found a place where someone was welcomed, honored, celebrated, and uplifted for a vast majority of our traditions of who we are, right? So I share that with you.
So let's talk about that for a minute in terms of talking about space and safe space within our communities. I think of my own experience as a comedian. I go into these small communities and I'll do comedy late at night, and it's usually after the comedy show, after people have had quite a few drinks, that I'll have women come up to me and say, "You're so lucky that you live out, that you and your wife, you have a wife," and that's very important to me. I've been told oftentimes on mainstream media, stop referring to your wife. Everything doesn't have to be gay. Well, yes, it does. Anytime anybody is listening, they have to hear me out so that they can be empowered to be out. And that is why I refer to my wife all the time. I also argue Oprah refers to Stedman all the time, and they don't tell her to stop talking about it. So in terms of making space, safety and space, how will we do that moving forward? And I put that question to both of you. Maybe we'll start, Albert, with you. How do we make the safe space for notions of gender expression and gender role and sexuality, even sexuality? The very mention of sexuality, thanks to colonization, is seen as something dirty, or that we shouldn't speak of. I'm Mi'kmaq from the East Coast, and I don't speak my language. And I asked a very dear elder of mine one day, how do I say vagina in Mi'kmaq? And she was really taken aback. And I said, what? And she said, you can't say that word on stage. And I said, why not? And she said, because it's derogatory. I said, well, what is the non-derogatory term for vagina? She said, there is none. So as a woman, as a Mi'kmaq woman, how can I even speak to my own existence when there isn't even a word in my own language that is not seen as derogatory? So I put that out there to both of you. And again, I'll start with you, Albert. Just how do we start to move towards a place where we can safely have these discussions and not be quieted by people saying we're being disrespectful to elders, or that we're somehow being vulgar, that sexuality is normal and healthy?
Well, I think it is reclaiming sort of social norms that existed, as late as the 1800s, like 1890. And I know that, because of residential schools, it slowly, intimidated people to stop some of the storytelling and So I work with Roger Roulette here in Winnipeg, who's an Ojibwe language specialist, and also his colleague Pat Ningwans Nadeau. And so they're kind of the litmus test for cultural sort of validity in terms of language and history and cultural practice. And I think in 2018, Pat Ningwans launched her book, 19 Ojibwe Legends from Lac Seul. And they're kind of a phenomenon now because her stories are not edited from how she learned them as a child, about the age of 10, and her mother told them to her. And Pat's been able to preserve these stories for this generation. And I think it's because we're at a time of openness and we're interested in cultural, competency and validity. And so she's published this book of 19 legends and the various topics, but again, it's the philosophy behind them or the mechanism, because, there's usually a moral teaching for an adult in the story, as well as a teaching for the children who listen to the story. So it's kind of has a dual purpose. But I'll give you an example of some of the titles of her stories. One is The Giant Penis or The Big Penis. And another one is The Man Who Taught His Penis How to Talk.
Mm-hmm.
And in her launch, Pat said she was not going to apologize for how some people might perceive this as being explicit and not suitable for children, she said, because this is part of Ojibwe culture and history that goes back thousands of years. So each story would have been developed over time, fine-tuned and preserved and passed down through generations because they had a purpose of giving a teaching about survival or, socialization, and especially to children. So that's an example of reclaiming. And the other example about safer spaces I want to share, in 1988, we began our international Two-Spirit gathering. So it was really joining in with our counterparts in the US who were Indigenous and LGBTQ. And since 1988, we've hosted an international Two-Spirit gathering for the last 32 years in North America. And I think we've traveled to 18 different places in North America, as far south as Tucson, in the mountains of BC, up in Malasite territory in northern New Brunswick on the Quebec border. And to me, that has been our reconciliation. We've created for 4 days of every year a safe place where we can be who we are, where we can share our stories, we can share our humor, we can nurture each other, we can love each other, and we can share our culture. We have sweat lodges, we have a powwow, we eat traditional food. And the reality is it should be like that every day for Two-Spirit people, for Two-Spirit youth. That is the legacy that the TRC is talking about, that it shouldn't just be 4 days of the year, it happens in North America. So we've been on this journey a lot longer than the TRC and this concept of reconciliation. We began reconciling back as early as 1975.
Thank you for that, Albert. I need to see those stories, because I think for us to ever love ourselves, we have to be able to name every part of ourselves. How are we ever going to stop sexual violence if we don't talk about healthy sexual identity and healthy sexual activity? So I'm so thrilled to hear about those stories. I will be looking for those. If I can't find them, I will email you. Harlan, can you talk to that subject of space, creating space for us in the world?
Sure. Again, thank you, Albert. Again, I'm like struggling right now because knowing our stories, right? Knowing who we are is where I was going to. So now I have to like reframe my answer. But it seems like, and so it's, I don't want to repeat what Albert said. So I know that for myself is, I've had the honor to do a lot of work on in territory and with my cis and heterosexual Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so you can tell from my opening position is that I actually don't use LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, queer questioning and intersex framing when talking about Two-Spirit, and I use like our traditional understanding and our traditional words. And what I have found is that, and so part of the training is I have this one slide, and it's building upon the work of Joseph P. Gone, who is this Gros Ventre native, and he's straight as well as heterosexual and cis. And he defines historical trauma as a combination of immense losses and traumatic events that are perpetrated upon an entire culture. And I added, it is through policies and laws, and those policies and laws are upheld by a criminal injustice system, or the courts of the conqueror, as Echo Hart books names it. For Native people, this includes the losses of culture, language, land, people, ways of life, economic systems, ceremonies, and family structures. And that last point, family structures, is huge, because it's your families that are your key building blocks for societies and nations. And so if the family is being ripped apart and not made whole through these policies like residential schools, day schools, the 60 scoop, and other policies, is that how can you build healthy nations or societies? You can't, right? When the key building block. And my question that I always ask the folks that I'm working with is like, what else was taken from us? And the question that I'm answering is Two-Spirit. But I resist the temptation of listing Two-Spirit within those bullet points. Like, unlike the broader non-native LGBT community that wants a separate community center, a separate space, a separate parade. And I understand, I'm not being critical, I'm merely observing and I'm merely reflecting. I understand why, that there is a need for that segregation and that safety space, like what Albert was talking about, those gatherings, right? We need that. But what for me, and standing in front of my cis heterosexual brothers, Indigenous brothers and sisters, is to remind them that we had a place in our culture. We had words within our language, our relationship to our great mother, the land, people, ways of life, economic systems and roles within that system, that we also had a ceremonial role, and that we were a part of every family. And so and what I have found has been incredibly transformative is that so many of my straight cis brothers and sisters are like, shnikes, I got this whole gay thing wrong. You're not a gay Indian. And then what they go into this dreaming place of like, shnikes, what else have I gotten wrong? And they go into this place of like freeing their mind. And if they ever lose their mind, they go back to this conversation around Two-Spirit. And so it is this, I think that we offer a pathway of like freeing our minds so that we can decolonize our minds, our soul, and our spirits, so that we can go into this questioning space. And I think the harder work, and right now I work at the BC Center for Disease Control, and I was hired for an Indigenous public health program, and I was going to like start a Two-Spirit program. And what I found was like, one, there's Two-Spirit organizations here in Vancouver and in BC, and I would have put me in direct competition with them, and also a duplicating of services. And I was like, let me critically think about, where is homophobia and transphobia and hatred going to dwell? It's not going to dwell with us, members of the Two-Spirit. There will be notions of internalized hatred, but we can work through that, and that's a part of our healing journey. But where homophobia and transphobia is going to dwell is with our straight, cis, Native brothers and sisters. And so what I started doing is doing work within our men's health program and within our women's health program to remind them to be in better relations with our Two-Spirit relatives. So I, standing in front of 40, presumably straight, but definitely cis Native brothers, and holding conversations around Two-Spirit, of what is Two-Spirit, who is Two-Spirit. And then I remember the conversation, and if I sweat, is because it was totally transformative for myself. one of the most respected men in our movement here in BC, Buckshot leaned in and said, you know, as men who are working for health of our nations and within our nations, what is our responsibility to signal to our Two-Spirit relatives that they're welcome, independent of assignment, to partake in our programming? It wasn't the work. It wasn't like, what is our commitment? The word responsibility came to me. And then all of the other 39 men picked up the conversation, is what is our responsibility? And so I know that I'm in a position in which that I have really thick skin. Someone can call me an Indian, someone can call me a fag. But the work has to be with the outside of our community. And so I've taken a much harder, it's not a harder, it's just a different way of working. Let me correct myself. But it's working with our cis and heterosexual brothers and sisters, and the reconciliation of getting in better relations, and where people see and witness my humanity and not who I sleep with. And also, and witnessing and acknowledging and a respect of the sacred space that dwells between us, but also within us. And I think that is the work. And my work and my purpose is that I rededicated myself to working with my straight cis brothers as well as sisters in reconciling and getting in better relations.
Thank you for sharing that. My elders tell me when people share their tears with you, they're honoring you. So we thank you for that. And it sounded like such a profound moment, and wonderful for the viewers to be able to witness that. This is the point where I am going to open up questions to you at home who are watching. You can type your questions into the comments on Facebook, and then I will ask them to Albert and Harlan. I want to encourage you that this is a very rare situation where we have these two very knowledgeable, very generous souls here ready to, as Rita Joe would say in her famous poem, I Lost My Talk, to gently offer their hands and teach you about them. So please take advantage of that and ask some questions. The first question that's coming in is saying, as a Métis straight cis woman, and I don't always feel comfortable wearing a skirt to ceremony, it seems to identify me as a womb, and that is all I have to offer to the community, is my ability to have children. And as a 51-year-old Mi'kmaq woman without kids, I get that all the time. People think there's something wrong with me that I didn't have children. I introduce them to my dog and I tell them Denise and I are trying. I just can't seem to get pregnant. This makes me feel very uncomfortable. Is there another way to look at wearing a skirt, or is there another way to look at Indigenous feminism and gender identity?
Yeah, for me, I believe today, you know, I've heard that story so much about skirt shaming, or, you know, forcing trans women to sit with the men in the sweat lodge or Sundance. And really, I believe today that no Indigenous organization that hires an elder or a knowledge keeper should be funded to perpetuate homophobia or transphobia through spirituality. It doesn't jibe today in the sense of with the Truth and Reconciliation and the 231 calls to justice by the you know, inquiry on murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, in that people who come for healing are vulnerable, and that the needs of the healers, the knowledge keepers, the elders are not prominent. And that's what I understand about healing, is that they are vessels. The relationship for the healing is through the individual and the spiritual realm, and that humans are not to interfere with that relationship. They are told to do what they're supposed to do to facilitate that ceremony. They are not supposed to make judgments on the spirit that has approached that doorway to participate in that healing. So things have to change, and that, you know, people have to get over clothing. You know, we have so many issues in our community: domestic violence, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, suicide ideation. Why are our healers obsessed about a piece of cloth? You know, if they are true healers, that's not going to matter. You know,
So
the
true.
power of the Spirit is there, regardless of what's going on. And we're not supposed to be watching other people. You know,
Yes,
at the Sundance, they say, look at the top of the tree, don't look at the other people.
right.
And we always get caught up with people who, and I think it is a legacy of Indian residential and day schools. It's still that patriarchal idea about masculinity and femininity, and it's still entrenched in our traditional community.
So true. We have another question. This one is to Albert specifically. And it's saying, Albert, can you speak about the meeting with Perry Belgard on the calls to action?
Well, in 2015, and I think, you know, Harlan alluded to this about our heterosexual counterparts in Indigenous organizations. In Canada, we established a mental health continuum that included Two-Spirit and LGBT First Nations. And there was a conference here in 2015 in Winnipeg, and I phoned them up and I said, you know, are you having a session on Two-Spirit people? And they said, no, we were not planning on it. And I was going to go ballistic, but I thought better of it. And I said, well, if there's an opening, I'd be interested in coming and doing a workshop. A couple hours later, there was an opening, and I went and I did 2 workshops during that mental health conference. During that time, we got a request from Perry Belgard, who's the national chief. And we met with him, and we left him with 3 recommendations. One is, you know, that he educate First Nations about Two-Spirit people, the history, the lived experience today, that he support the annual International Two-Spirit Gathering, and that he establish a Two-Spirit Council at the national level. Because the AFN has a Women's Council, an Elders Council, and a Youth Council.
True.
They don't have a Two-Spirit Council. And that's what we mean about change, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are adults. I'm 64. I'm not a child. I don't need to be treated as a child by my peers or by chiefs, by elders. You know, we should have our own council at the national level of Two-Spirit people, because we don't need straight people telling us what we need. We know what we need, and we know how to do it. So the AFN did support a national call for a Two-Spirit national organization, and they supported that in a resolution in 2018. So they get a gold star for that. So some progress.
We have another question coming in. Harlan, I'm going to ask you to handle this one, and it's a great question because I hear this all the time. It says, hi there, can there be confusion between someone being trans and someone being Two-Spirit? I think the public gets the two confused, and I think that is true. I hear that all the time. When people hear Two-Spirited, they instantly go to either trans or bisexual. Can you talk to that, Harlan, in terms of why that confusion, why you think that confusion exists, and how to maybe differentiate?
Sure. One is, I see that you edited the question because it says someone being trans and someone being Two-Spirited. And when you edit it saying Two-Spirit, because Two-Spirited, you only add ed if it's a verb. Mm-hmm. Where we are not verbs, we're nouns, right? So it's just Two-Spirit, not Two-Spiritness, an adjective, it's just Two-Spirit. And there is some confusion because trans and transgender is an umbrella term to identify those who are on the gender spectrum. And it was a political term to, and again, it was similar to Two-Spirit, of anything that is gender diverse or that's gender non-binary. And so, but at the same time, it was also to organize and to bring light to folks who are embracing biomedical interventions to assist them in walking their truth.
Right.
Or what we would say, and I know that the word is like it's transsexual, but I don't actually use that word, so I describe those who embrace biomedical interventions to assist them in walking their truth. And so for us, within the Two-Spirit movement, it is about our gender role and our gender expression, but it is also non-binary. In that, for my Cree tradition, we had 4 different genders, and that's a part of that conversation. Some nations had 6 genders, some nations had up to 7 different genders, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is a gender analysis, and it can, where for trans is gender nonconform. And so they kind of are related, but they're not related. Trans is also a Western concept, a Western notion, where right. Two-Spirit harkens back to this pre-contact or this traditional role. And that they are not, similarly, like so many people think that Two-Spirit is a placeholder for someone who's a gay Indian or trans Indian, right. Where what you've already seen from my talk is that there is something radically different between those Western notions and someone who's Two-Spirit, which is this harkening back to this pre-contact and this pre-colonization. There is also, I just want to be fully transparent, that there is some inherent contradiction, some inherent tension between folks who are trans-identified and Indigenous, and the Two-Spirit movement. So what I'm playing out there, and which we see, and it's much more prominent within the United States, in which that for the Two-Spirit movement is about reclaiming and restoring our rightful place in honor and respect. And for trans is those that are embracing modern technologies to assist them in their truth, right? Biomedical interventions. And so you can kind of see the positionality of like reclaiming and restoring, and to folks that are using modern technologies and modern interventions to assist them in walking their truth. And so how do you restore something in which that is like these new interventions, right? And so it puts us at odds in our conversations. And so there is tension there, right? For myself, is how I resolve that is that at that level of conversation, there is tension because we don't actually have a history of people, using biomedical interventions to assist them within their walking their truth. So what I do is I elevate it to a higher Indigenous ethic, and the Indigenous ethic is that we did not throw our relatives away. So if I remember, I was at a gathering in Brooklyn, a powwow, and I remember a bus coming in, and I was sitting there in my tent doing some Two-Spirit outreach, and there were all these folks with like mental challenge, disabilities, were mental and or physical, and they were walking in front of me. And I remember my teachings of it was often our folks who had physical challenges as well as mental challenges that were often considered our holiest, because they had something that we didn't have to offer. And for my contemporary trans brothers and sisters is I would like to uplift them because they're walking a story and a narrative that I will never walk. And so they bring something new and rich to the conversation. And within that, I want to lift up them and to like learn from them, because they're going to bring a story and a narrative to us today that will only offer us a broadening of the conversation. So on a Two-Spirit level, there's some tension, but on an Indigenous level, and that ethic of like, we don't throw our relatives away, we lift up, celebrate, and honor diversity and inclusion, and we like learn from it. And so that is where I move the conversation of like, we're all different. Like you and I and Albert are all different. Right. It doesn't make me better than you. It doesn't make me worse, but we can learn from one another, from someone who's in Winnipeg to someone who's in Toronto. Let's lend in and learn from one another. No different if we were trans, non-binary, gender non-queer, however we want to show up, or from different nations.
Thank you for that. We have another kind of a comment / question. it's saying that people in my community who aren't native to my territory have come to live here and develop wildly successful careers while weaponizing Two-Spirit as an identity and positioning themselves as champions of the community while discarding me. Uh, when I've faced terrible discrimination related to my gender identity, and I'm trying to see where this was cut in two different places. My point, oh yeah, she said, the person said I pressed enter by mistake. My point is that people have come to my community to use the Two-Spirit identity to build their careers and hold positions of power in which they pretend to care about people like me. But when I ask for help against the discrimination, I've been violently rejected. Now, everywhere I live, these people's presence is inescapable, and I need help because the community isn't accessible to me in any way. So I'm not, are you guys catching what, I'm not sure if, when this person is saying they're being regarded, or they're being discarded because of their identity, I'm not sure if you understand what their identity is.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think part of this really goes back to what Roger Roulette has shared about creation of humans. And he said that, you know, when the mother's pregnant and we know the baby's coming, the community is ready for that baby to come. And we don't know, you know, whether it'll be trans or straight or boy or a girl. But what is implicitly understood by the parents, the siblings, the grandparents, the community itself, he says that that being has a purpose, a role, a destiny, and possesses a divine gift. And that is the challenge to us, is we accept what Creator has made. We are not the Creator. You know, we can't make a rock, we can't make a tree, right? We can make humans, but, you know, they come with a gift. And part of this challenge is using that power that each baby has, right? And we're told by our elders, if you're struggling, you know, you put down your tobacco, you make an offering, and
Right.
then you let Spirit guide you.
Mm.
And those answers will come. And this is the thing about Indian residential schools. The early colonizers saw and understood that power. And because they were Christian, they could not convert to that belief system, even though they understood its power.
Right.
They would rather have destroyed it than collaborate and honor its power. That's why there was so much violence, you know, sexual violence, physical violence.
The person
Right?
who was asking that question has come back to us and said they identify as trans, Mohawk, and Inuk, but afraid to say it publicly. Let me just say from me to you, wherever you are, I'm sending you a big hug and glitter-covered candy kisses. And that's the very reason why every time I have a public mic, I am out, because I want to create a place, a world where it is safe for everyone to be out. So first of all, my heart is breaking for you that you're feeling that where you are. Understand that all three of us are sending our good vibes to you. We wish you were in the room with us. We would give you a group hug. But thank you for that really important question and for being brave enough to send that comment out to us. I don't know if either of you want to elaborate any more on that.
I just want to say, you know, that power of just offering tobacco, that takes energy. It's an intention that comes from your psyche, your spirit, and it is so, so powerful. No matter what's going on around you, the chaos, whatever, don't even, you know, look at that. Just concentrate on that offering. And there's a term in Ojibwe that Roger shares with me. It's a minaguwisi win. It means given or received from the divine, right? And that's the ability we have. That's the gift we all carry from when we're born, when we're birthed, is we can tap into that.
Yes.
And our spirit guides are benevolent. They love us, right? And they will answer our call. And just keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, and you will recognize that that call from your spirit is being answered.
First of all, thank you so much, Kandi, for sending love, it makes my heart so sad and heavy to hear this experience of like, because I do see the weaponizing of Two-Spirit identity and positioning themselves as champions of our community while discarding me. There is so much violence, red on red violence, or what we want to call lateral violence. And it even happens within our community. I know that as someone who is involved with the Two-Spirit movement within Canada and the United States, is that my name has been dragged through the mud of like people thinking that, why do I get all the attention? Why, like, and how come like Harlan gets to go here? And why does Harlan do that? Meanwhile, there is so much work within the Two-Spirit community.
Yeah.
And that there is so, like, I wish that I didn't have to do so much public speaking. And that's why I've been working with Bear Smith, who is Shinsham and Haisla, and turning over my talk to Bear so that Bear can do the talk, so that I can go on to finish my children's book, finish my other projects that have been lingering on the vine because I've been doing all this other stuff. That there is so much work in the community. And so for in the comment of like, I identify as trans, Mohawk, and Inuk, but I'm afraid to say it publicly. To my teaching is I share with you my own journey, is that the two things that I was most ashamed about growing up was that I was an Indian, because Indian, as Wab Canoe says in his book, you know, that Indian always had an adjective: dirty Indian, stupid Indian, drunk Indian. Yeah. Immense amount of shame and internalized racism. And I was a little sissy boy, fag, queer. When I leaned in and I drew and it's our secrets that keep us sick. Those words used to have so much power over me. When I called them and I brought them home in a way in which that through therapy, through talking it, through friends, when I called them home and owned them, then they became places of great strength that I was called upon twice by President Obama. Why? Because I'm a sissy boy Indian, and I know a little bit of policy work, and I'm an advocate.
Beautiful.
Here is the medicine for you. Again, you are trans, Mohawk, and Inuk. Call those home. And if I am not special, and when you own it, and you then feel it, and what Albert was like saying, that intentionality around the tobacco, that it will be this place of beauty. And who knows that you will maybe be called on by the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. Why? Because you are trans Mohawk Inuk and you have voice. So I share that with you of like, our secrets is what keeps us sick and gives it power. Plus, we also have to toughen our skin, is that there is so much lateral violence within our community. And when I see lateral violence, I just look at it as us being colonized and pitting ourselves against us, and we must free ourselves. And so when I see it and witness, I lean even harder, and then I put the little tobacco down and I say a prayer for them. Mm. And I have to, because if I respond with hatred, then I'm no better than they are. And colonization has won because it has changed who I am. Amen. And so it is, that is the hardest teaching, because I just want to pulverize them into dust and fight against them. But what I must do is pray for them. And it hurts. It really hurts.
Yes. Thank you for that. Such deep thoughts. I hope that helps you. We have time for one more question. And that question is, some articles aimed at parents of LGBTQ2S+ children focus on creating a safe space for children to come out. How can parents with Two-Spirit children be supportive and help reclaim traditional understandings of gender role and gender expression? Albert, have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll tell you about a powwow I was in Fort Capel, Treaty Number 4 grounds. And, powwows are so genderized, but we were watching the young ones dance, and it was the little boys' grass dance, about 7 and 8 year old. And there was a pole in the middle, and the boys were dancing around it. And there was this little 2-year-old girl in traditional women's regalia. She had the long dress, she had a little duck fan, and a little breastplate. She's sitting in a tiny little chair, and she saw those boys dancing in the circle. And she got up and she walked into that circle and she danced in between them. A 2-year-old, she could barely, just learning how to walk. I don't even think she was 2. And that's what we have for our children, our babies, our young children, our adolescents who are Two-Spirit. They're already completely formed. Like I said, they have a purpose, a role, a destiny, and they possess divine gifts. And they will show us. If a little boy wants to wear a dress, then let him wear the dress. Again, it's back to this clothing, police, and we don't know. We don't know if they might be, trans and get married and have 6 kids and 10 grandkids. We're not in control of that.
They might just like a dress. Like, who says,
Yeah, and to me that is what is Dr. Claire Brandt did some of this work before he died suddenly around Indigenous parenting and the psychology of raising, is the ethic of non-interference. And that when I've talked to parents who have a trans or a Two-Spirit kid, I said, your child doesn't have to change. They don't have to conform. It's you. You change, because the reality is you have a trans or a Two-Spirit child. So you better learn what that means, and they'll teach you, right? We are very gifted.
And I think before I go to Harlan, one of the best things parents can do is show your children who you are. My mother, I was about 12 when my mother heard a story of someone in our community who rejected her son who was dying of AIDS. And he wanted to come home, and she said no. And my mother was not a crier. My dad and I cry at commercials. My mother does not cry. My mother was sitting at the table crying, and I heard her saying to my father, "What mother could reject their child for any reason, let alone a reason that ridiculous?" So at 12, long before I met and fell in love with my wife, my mother showed me who she was. She showed me she was someone who loves her children, who does not see sexual identity or orientation as any reason to love her children any differently. And that was so empowering for me. When I did come out, people said, "Your parents are so old, how are they going to react?" I said, "I already know how my mother's going to react, because my mother showed me who she was." So I think for parents, that is a great little piece of advice. Harlan, I'm going to come to you on the last thought on that.
Sure. Some really practical things is like seek out spaces and ceremonies that are inclusive and welcoming. I know that the fasting ceremony that I go home to on my territory is although I fast with the men, they allow me to go and sit with the women, and I can talk. And so they're inclusive of my Two-Spirit identity. I can't go to the women's camp, but I go to a neutral place and I can sit and talk to my sisters. There's also a Sundance that I go to, in which that a female assigned individual dances in the middle of the arbor and not on the outside of the arbor, and wears a shirt. And so there are ceremonies out there that are welcoming and inclusive of our Two-Spirit relatives. On a more practical way, Rainbow Crow, which is a beautiful, it doesn't speak directly to Two-Spirit, but the teaching is there. Just like what you shared about your mother, there's a really great Two-Spirit teaching within the Rainbow Crow story. 47,000 beads. It's a U.S. Two-Spirit, and it's that exact story that Albert just shared about going to powwow and dancing, and it's a beautiful, many teachings within that. And for a Canadian is Eagle's Path by Michelle Contreau, who is Mohawk, who is not Two-Spirit, although they use Two-Spirited. And then I myself am working on a children's Two-Spirit book. I hope that I would have more time and that it can be done. But those are the 2 stories. There's only two Two-Spirit children's books. you can get them, and I can actually see if I can post some links within the Facebook page. But again, I don't think I have anything else to add. That's it. Thank you.
Perfect. One of the viewers asked for the doctor's name again that Albert mentioned, and Albert typed it, but in case you're not seeing the comments, it is Dr. Claire Brandt, and Dr. Claire Brandt is Mohawk. That brings us to the end of our discussion. What a wonderful way for us to celebrate the fact that June is both Pride Month and it's also Indigenous Peoples Month. So it was a real honor to be able to come together and have this discussion. I want to thank the NCTR for making this space for us. And I want to thank, first on behalf of myself, I want to thank Harlan and Albert. I learned so much from both of you today, and I wish we could have been in a room together, and hopefully that will happen somewhere down the road. But I'm sure I speak for the viewers and for the NCTR when I say thank you so much for being here. Before we go, Albert, could you let people know where they can find you online?
Yeah, albertmcleod.com or twospiritmanitoba.ca. I'll
Wonderful.
take them in the thing.
And Harlan?
Sure. If you just Google my name and or go to the twospiritjournal.com, there's a contact page there, or just hpruden@gmail.com. And if you Google my name, you'll find my cell phone number up there, whatever it is. But if you do reach out to me, it takes me a little while to get to messages. I will get to them eventually, but it just takes me a little time to respond. So thank you so much. And again, what an honor to be here with Albert, with you, Kandi, and I can think no better way than to celebrating this month and acknowledging this month with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
And I'm Kandi Palmiter. I was your host today. You can find me on all the social media or on my website, all under The Kandi Show. Kandi spelled C-A-N-D-Y. So anywhere you put The Kandi Show in, that's me. Once again, thank you to the audience for tuning in to this very important discussion. This is what it's going to take. We have to get together and have these conversations. I'm thrilled to say that in this time of lockdown, when we tried the very first conversation via this technology of Zoom, Facebook Live, it went smooth without a hitch. So yay us. And it is with a spirit of love and graciousness that I thank you all, and I bid you a good day.